Misha here, and this is a bit of a follow-up because I thought it was a really good idea. And then we're going to get back to the review comparison I was doing with the piston ARs, but it was timely. And I want to do a little bit of a disambiguation and talk about how we got here. This is my M17 P320 that I have had essentially since these came out in 2017, thereabouts. I never wanted or got the commemorative edition, anything. I waited till I got it on sale. And this is my M18 that I relatively recently picked up because only recently did they start selling, at least non-special edition, the military style. And you might think, oh, it's the Romeo 17 optic. No, there are other differences too, including with slide cuts and whatnot. And then, of course, everything happened. I've already given my opinion, and that video is based on what folks had asked me on Patreon and elsewhere. And I released that video when I did, the day I did, because I wanted to give SIG-Sauer Incorporated in Newington, New Hampshire, a chance to officially respond. Once they did, to the airman's death, I thought it was time for me to just say what I did. And of course, I commented on a historical level and basis. But there are questions about who SIG-Sauer is, and there's a really good question of how we got here. How it went from being a very respectable brand name, tip-top, up there with HK, even older than HK, to where we're at today. And there's a ton of confusion about SIG-Sauer in the USA, SIG-Sauer in West, and then just Germany, and SIG-Sauer in Switzerland. I don't blame you. It's confusing. So that's really what I want to talk about is how we got here, the history of these companies, how only two exist today, and how we ended up with the M17 320 issue. And throughout this video, in between looking at historical SIG guns, I will monkey around with my guns and see if I can make anything happen. To be fair with that M17, I've put quite a few rounds through it over many years and nothing's ever happened. This one, relatively new, although I have put probably 600 rounds through it by now. Under 1,000, over 500, something like that. Again, nothing weird, but it is a newer production. As I mentioned in the first video, even though mine seem fine, yes, it does that little hang-up thing on the slide. All the M18s seem to. Anyway, Jay's, he picked up one. His was rough, and now that I'm back here at the house, I can show you mine and show you where his was interesting and maybe one of the issues. We'll see. But yeah, we're going to look back at SIG, see how they made their name, and see where the blame falls and who owns what and what's doing what today to kind of get there. I really appreciate all the support in the last two videos, especially. I put out the SIG-Sauer one, and then I put out the one about me. That was one I was actually kind of going to do for Labor Day, but I thought, since there were a lot of questions about me being blind in the other video, I thought, yeah, let's go ahead and release it now. Why not? And both of those videos were kind of directly because of Patreons, and this one is too, because of asking for a disambiguation. But then we're going to go back to messing with the LMT, the HK, and the T91 for that matter, although it's got its own video. And I've got a lot of other new footage to show you, so don't you worry. I just thought, since this is kind of the talk of the town, I would weigh in, and my opinion's not worth any more than yours, but, you know, I can share my thoughts. And I invite you to do the same in the comments. Commenting's always good. As always, though, just be polite, more to each other than myself. Say what you want about me, but just be nice to other people if you could, please. And if you'd like to help support the channel, there is Patreon. There's also super thanks on YouTube, or liking, sharing, and subscribing. That's all great too if money's tight, because it is for me right now as well. But with that, We will get back to this SIG, but let's go back to the beginning, to 19th century Switzerland and a wagon making company. SIG, as we know it, was founded in 1853 in the town of Neuhausen, which is in the northern part of Switzerland. And for the first decade or so, they mostly made wagons, carriages, train cars, other things. But it wouldn't be long until they would get into firearms. By the 1860s, the Swiss federal government wanted domestic production as opposed to, buying outside. And this would eventually lead to the company known as SIG by this point to apply for contracts, and they would get their first big one around 1867, making Peabody rifles. Then in the 1870s, they would make quite a few Vetterlis, various versions, into the 1880s. Now, they're not the primary maker. They're still young at this point. The factory at Bern, the W&F Bern, was the official Swiss federal government arsenal factory, as it were. But SIG was kind of the fallback, and while the firearms division wasn't really intended to get so big, the money was there, and so it would grow and grow until we get to the early 20th century, where it's a big chunk of their business. Then we get to the 1880s and rapid advancements in firearms. Now, in Switzerland, the small diameter cartridge was pioneered there. And then, of course, France would have the first smokeless powder in the 1886, commonly called the Lebel. Then Germany would do the 88, the commission rifle. But Switzerland, not to be left behind, in 1889 would introduce this fine rifle, the Schmidt-Reuben, in 7.5 by 53. This is the early version of the cartridge. And again, primary production would be at Bern. However, by the 1890s, they could not produce enough. They would actually make well over 200,000 of these. So SIG was brought in for components in full production. They would produce other versions too, including carbines, of course, including later variants too. But this is the first thing. They're still a minor player, but getting more and more important. And this is really where Swiss engineering and craftsmanship comes into play. The Schmidt-Reuben is an elegant design, pretty forward-thinking. 12-shot box mag on this version. Of course, it's a big old long barrel gun. And the straight pull with the beer keg, well, that's not going anywhere for a long time. But this early version had issues mainly to do with the location of the locking lugs and just overall cost of machining. Now, the model 1896 would improve the locking lug system, and then the model 9611 would be an update to fire the new 7.5 by 55, the GP11 round that is in some use still today. SIG would be there, part of this. But then the Swiss straight pull we all know and love. This was probably my first introduction to Swiss firearms, and a lot of ours, because my goodness, were these just the best thing going on the surplus market. For years, you could pick one up for $100 in cherry condition, except for the stock being chewed up back here. Otherwise, yeah, even before that, they were about $300 before the big Century import batch. Criminally underpriced for a long time, and they were on the market for a bit. Anyway, the Carabine 31, K31. By the way, the year designations on Swiss guns tend to be when the pattern was finalized, not necessarily the year it was officially adopted. For example, this wasn't formally officially adopted until 1933. This was not technically a Schmidt-Reuben, but just a simplified and improved version based on his rifle. And again, Bern was the lead factory here, but now, out of the nearly 530,000 built, it would almost be 50-50. SIG would take a big chunk of production, and they'd still build these before, during, and after World War II. And if you'd like to see a video revisiting the history of Swiss straight pulls, I'd love to bring you one, so drop it in the comments. But I just wanted to bring these out because these are some of the earliest Swiss SIG in Neuhausen produced guns. Now, at this time, the factory has other divisions. They're doing other things. Packaging materials are still doing transportation things, all kinds of other tooling. But the firearms division is a pretty big chunk, employing hundreds of people during the World War II era. But this video's on handguns, sidearms. The first real, true, successful Swiss SIG design, still in Neuhausen, still making wagons and stuff. In the 1920s, they got interested in handguns, submachine guns for that matter. In 1937, they purchased production rights, patent rights, to what was known as the Browning-Petter system. It actually has a better fit than you'd think. The gentleman who designed this pistol, Charles Petter, was actually Swiss, although this is the French SACM 35A, so they actually purchased rights to this pistol from the company in France a couple of years after it was adopted. And that was because they were still tinkering around with what they wanted to do. And they really got serious in 1942. They had trials during the middle of World War II with, of course, this pistol, the Browning High Power, the Polish Vis 35, the Colt 1911A1, and, of course, the Luger, which was at the time the standard Swiss Federal Army's sidearm. And this led to some prototypes in 1944, but the war slowed things down. Then they picked it back up in 47 with the SP-47-8 prototype. Based on this loosely, credit to them for not just ripping it off. And then we get this, the P-49, or as it was known commercially at the time, the SP-47-8 single stack 8-shot mag. But because they had studied the high power, they did have a 16-shot version. Why they went with the 8 over the 16, I would imagine size. This is the pistol that put SIG on the map and really started them on the road for design and craftsmanship. And this is a really good example of what they were doing. It's still a single action. It's already looked at, just a 8+1 capacity. It's 9mm. Heel release. It does use a slide system based on the Petter, but the slide rides inside the frame, which has certain advantages and some disadvantages. You can see one right there. It's a little hard to release on an empty mag. Pop that out. There we go. Safety is also not the best on this, but man, are they nice. This is an early military version with the high gloss blue, wood grips, flat release. So this was their first design. It was tested in 1948 and officially adopted in 49, and the first large-scale military contract came late that year, and they'd be very successful, ultimately delivering over 113,000 to the Swiss Army, other branches, police, government, what have you. And maybe for the very first time, or at least close to it, they had some export as well. For you see, they built about 350,000. The rest would go to various police agencies and export customers, and even private sales. West Germany was one, Kazakhstan was one, and it was just kind of random countries here and there. And they did learn how to simplify their construction a bit. Here's a later pistol 49, P49. It does have more of a bead blasted blued, synthetic grips, a few product improvements like the release here. If you would like a video on Swiss handguns, let me know. But this does show they could simplify for mass production. But this was still an extremely expensive extremely well-refined handgun, kind of considered the finest military-issue handgun in the world, if not at least Europe. It was also known for high accuracy. On the flip side, to be fair, outside of just the craftsmanship and the accuracy, not extremely innovative, if even a little bit traditional. Nevertheless, built like a tank, and would serve officially for 25 years and unofficially for another 25 after that. But these were not well known in North America for reasons we'll get to in just a second. But first, let's talk about really their first successful rifle design. So, we have a new pistol replacing the older Lugers. What about the venerable K31? It's getting 20 plus years old, and of course it's a bolt action and 7.5. And that's what SIG turns their attention to next, hoping to kind of take it away from the WF Burn factory. And they have prototypes, and then they begin testing this, originally known as the AM55. It would be tested in 1956 against, the other guns of the day, and officially adopted in 1957 as the Sturmgewehr 57, STGW 57. Yeah, quite a jump from a bolt action to a select fire gun. Now this is, of course, a semi-automatic build. Still has the good old beer keg, though. Told you it wouldn't go away for a while. Hold down trigger. And it's still in the 7.5 chambering. This would be Switzerland's standard issue gun for over 3 decades. And they would produce well over 100,000 for the Swiss Armed Forces. It's an interesting inspiration. Definitely not conventional. Takes a lot from World War II designs like the MG42 roller delayed gun, and it was intended to be cheaper. It actually uses stamped and welded components, synthetic furniture, although the prototype was wood, and it still ended up being really one of the most expensive general issue guns of all time, but also accurate and reliable, if also heavy. And SIG had hopes of exporting this. And it's because of this gun that really this gun earned its name. We know this today is the P210. That's kind of its commercial export name. It did not appear until 1957. The -1 is the high polished one. The -2 is the standard military. -4 was for Germany, so on and so forth. They've made several versions. In fact, they kept making these in Neuhausen up through 2006, at least in some variety. Well, likewise, this was known as the SG 510 series, kind of starting that off. So 210 and 510. -1 could either be, well, typically in the export version, it was in 7.62 NATO, not 7.5. And -2 and -3, they actually had a prototype in 7.62-39 for Finland. They even had a prototype in 30-06 for Mexico. But the only export customer of note was Chile with the 510-4, which was again in 7.62 NATO, and it was kind of a cut-down, lighter weight version of this. Fixed sights there on there. That goes to show you they were looking not just for the domestic market or even the European market, but post-war in the 50s, if you wanted to sell guns, you kind of had to look to the third world. And that wasn't a derogatory term. It was just, the first world and the second world were being supplied by the U.S. and Russia, respectively. But this is really where SIG runs into an issue. And by this point, their firearms division is really important. The factory still has other things going on, but they're employing 800, maybe as many as 1,000 employees in their firearms division at this point. And it's really critical. So they're thinking, let's export. Problem: Swiss neutrality. The government has pretty strict rules on where firearms can and can't be exported. And it has a lot to do with where wars are happening, political events are happening. It's not a, strictly speaking, ban, but it makes this whole thing very difficult to be commercially successful. So still into the 60s, most SIG guns are in Switzerland, West Germany, maybe a handful of other European nations, but they've made a handful of inroads, again like Chile, into South America. Yeah, that won't cause troubles 50, 60 years later, will it? But this does kind of explain where the whole SIG-Sauer comes from. Okay, we're getting to the meat of it. So they got a taste of the export, but Swiss things didn't work out so great. Now, they did have a partnership with Beretta in Italy. That didn't go anywhere, ended in 1968. So by the 70s, they're looking kind of for a new partner and a new gun and a new way of making guns. The 210 is great, but it's expensive, heavy, and it's pretty conventional. So SIG Neuhausen does work on everything new. A new design, going away from the French-inspired, Petter-inspired lock breech system to something much more conventional, kind of like a Glock or anything else. We're going to go double action, all this stuff. But more importantly, we're going to make it with new technology. In fact, it would be one of the very first mass-produced firearms to be built with CNC tooling and design specs. Of course, we're talking about the P220 and the partnership with J.P. Sauer & Son of Eckernford, West Germany. Now, design credit for this gun is given to Neuhausen, but I have to admit, the decocker, that's definitely Sauer, taken from the 38H. Just that I give credit. But we have a stamped-in rolled steel slide, so it is cheaper. We have an alloy frame. And still a conventional mag, 9-shot and 9mm with the heel release. Double, single action. This is an early Swiss police one because this would be adopted by the Swiss military as the P75. It's been 25 years, so, why not? But what they're going to do, design and all that, and basically managerial authorities in Switzerland, but a new partnership, a new company is opened up by 1976 called SIG-Sauer GmbH. This takes assets from J.P. Sauer. This takes the know-how from SIG in Neuhausen and puts it in West Germany. So manufacture and global export will be done by this new company, and that gets around Swiss laws and rules. Yeah, German laws and rules were less stringent back then. And timing is great. First, yes, this becomes the new Swiss sidearm, but it immediately starts getting exported around the world, and for the first time, officially into the USA. The first couple of importers were interesting. Halls out of California did some early ones by 77, 78. And they would actually have an interesting agreement with Browning Arms Company to market this as not the P220. Remember, there's no real official name yet. It becomes the Browning BDA. Now, this is very short-lived, it seems to be, and I could be wrong on this part, but oh well. Browning Arms Company, though, becomes the first big importer of note in the late 70s, and I think I had one as late as 81 dated that was still Browning marked. So yeah, the first ones were actually imported as Browning BDA. After that, it gets a little interesting. The product line expands. Started off in 9, by this point we've got 45. And then actually Seiko, or Sako if you prefer, gets involved, and that actually brings Stoeger into the mix. And while they're not the primary, they're very adjacent. In fact, it's thanks to Sako that the P226, the double stack version of this, gets entered into the XM9 trials in 1984, 1985. One of its earliest successes, too, back in West Germany, is by selling the P225, the compact version of this, to the German police. It was approved as the P6, and it was very popular because it was cheaper than the Walther P5 and definitely cheaper than the Heckler & Koch P7. So for once, they're able to make an affordable gun. It has a good trigger, good reputation for reliability. This is kind of what they've been aiming for all along. And back in the day, they were known for great quality, but also a good value. And so by, the mid-'80s, especially after the XM9 trials and this appearing in some Hollywood films, or rather the 226 version, this became the gun that kind of put the SIG-Sauer name, and yeah, it was SIG-Sauer because it came out of West Germany, on the map. I should just mention this gun very quickly. It is Swiss marked. These were assembled in Switzerland for legal and political reasons, but the raw parts and forgings were sent from West Germany. The two factories are actually quite close together geographically. So yeah, the military guns, the P75s, and the police guns like this were very, very nicely done in Switzerland, and the early ones pretty identifiable. So now we have SIG Neuhausen, and we have SIG-Sauer in Eckerford, West Germany. What about SIG-Sauer Incorporated USA? Here we have my P228. It is West German marked. I should mention that while it's often phrased as a partnership, the truth is that before 75, Switzerland got a controlling interest in the JP Sauer company. It was basically the bigger partner, and had a majority sharehold in the SIG-Sauer GmbH company. So while JP Sauer still remained a company, and we have SIG-Sauer in West Germany as a company, and we have Switzerland, so 3 companies there, the truth is Switzerland is at the top of all this food chain. And after going around with Browning and some work with Mishaco, they decided in 1985 to open up a U.S. branch to handle importation and marketing. Therefore, we get not SIG-Sauer Incorporated, but rather SIG Arms in Virginia, often credited as Tyson's Corner. That's kind of a region in Virginia near D.C. So that's the first area, and they focus on bringing over the 220, the 225, the 226, and yeah, eventually the 228. Fun fact, even though this one was made after 1991, they still kept marking these made in West Germany through at least 94, 95. It's kind of how those things go. Of course, there is one more gun we should talk about because it is relevant to what's going on today, and then we can really draw close to New Hampshire. As we move into the 80s, hey, it's time to replace this gun. It's cool. I really do like the Sturmgewehr 57, but it's an odd duck, and really the only buyer was Chile for all kinds of reasons. I should also mention that around 5,000 some autos were made. Namely, you think of the P57, that's actually a smaller number. A much larger number, known as the AMT, were sent over here. And while some came in via the new SIG Arms, a lot of them came in earlier than that via the Browning-Mishaco connection, so 82, 83. But yeah, by the 80s, the cartridge and everything about this, not to mention the cost, they had actually kind of quit making new guns already by the 70s anywho, just kind of refurbishing them at Neuhausen. And they wanted to go to a new small diameter high velocity cartridge, which makes sense because kind of Switzerland developed that. Boom, we get this gun, the STGW-90, or in this case the semi-automatic PE-90. Now you might say this is in 5.56. No, it's in 5.6 GP90. That way they can still claim neutrality because this is still Cold War. And much like with the P220, it was built with stamped and welded components, upper and lower. investment castings were possible, they tried to set out to make a cheaper gun than the previous SG 510. This being known as the SG 550. The version that SIG partnered with Beretta on was known as the SG 530. It never got past the prototype stage. Now the SG 540 from the 70s actually was licensed produced in Chile and was licensed produced in France by Manurhin, again quite close geographically speaking. So the 540 had some limited international success, and it was actually that they based it on, developed this, the 550s for the Swiss military, and really the design was ready by 1983, but because of political and economic reasons, they had a couple more years to refine it, make it a little better, and then this design was ready by 86. And I might be wondering why it's called the STGW 90, Sturmgewehr 90, because it wasn't actually officially adopted by the Swiss Army until 1990. Again, political and more economic reasons. Now today we think of these as super expensive, and they are not cheap, but while compared to other 223s, it is kind of expensive. The truth is it was cheaper and quite a bit lighter and shorter than the previous gun. And if you'd like to see a whole history video on these, well, check the channel. I've done a ton of them. I just want to mention it here because towards the end of the 80s, we did see a small number of these get imported too. Not very many, 400 or 500 of the 550, and just 50 or 100 of the 551 carbine version. This was just going into production and thus import when, in March of 1989, anyone who watches the channel much, you know what comes, the executive order from George Bush Sr., effectively an assault weapons import ban. It's more complicated than that, but you get the idea. I don't believe any of these came in with prior import marks like Browning or Seiko. I believe they were all SIG Arms out of Virginia. Fun fact though, there was a post-van version imported by DS Arms in the 1990s, but those seem to be exceedingly rare. But yeah, this replaced the previous rifle and shows SIG's continuing efforts at modernization, and that's pretty cool in my opinion, and it's one of my favorite guns, and we have these today thanks to JDI San Imports. So we have one final step to take. In 1990, SIG Arms moves from Virginia to Exeter, New Hampshire, and this is a bigger facility and they have bigger plans. Before, they were just importing guns, doing marketing. Here we have my early 210, high gloss finish, very nice but very spendy gun. Here is the somewhat cheaper militarized mass production version, still 100% Neuhausen made. Of course, that leads directly here. The 220 was always a joint venture, SIG-Sauer, made in West Germany, even if some were assembled in Switzerland. And then they really took off with the 226 and 228 double stackers. But while these passed the XM9 trials, and many think they should have won over the Beretta M9, yeah, remember those days? There is a problem with this. The Beretta M9, it's got a weak locking wedge, or not weak, but that's the part that's going to fail first. The problem with the 22X design is you have a stamped in rolled steel, carbon steel slide with roll pins with the breech pinned in. Over time, those roll pins will give way. Now, I don't mean quickly. We're talking 6,000 to 10,000 rounds before you start getting issues, and you'll notice them. Yeah, they're recommended to be replaced every 5,000 rounds. Pretty much analogous to the Beretta M9, the 92 FS. Cool. I bring this up because originally in New Hampshire, SIG Arms was just an importer. But then they started assembling guns from parts brought over from Germany. And then they started making some things here because it was simply easier, like frames. And then they started innovating a little bit by, 2000-ish. So to kind of complete the series, we have my P226 Mark 25. Yes, this is a 100% US made and really rather US designed gun. And this shows you that SIG Arms could innovate. They went from the carbon steel stamped slide to a stainless steel machined slide. This is stronger. It eliminates the problem. They also gave it rails, something you'll see more and more. And they did the 229 series, which got into 40 and 357, whereas your previous imports were really just 9mm or 45. At this time, they're making really good guns, I think. And they are, in some ways, improving on the Swiss-German designs. And we're still in New Hampshire. But in 2000, there's a real big change. SIG in Switzerland did very well with these to the Swiss military, selling hundreds of thousands. They did export some around the world in the SIG SG 550 series. This was under the SIG-Sauer brand, but aside from being kind of marketed and assembled in West Germany, these were kind of the bread and butter, the 55X series of Neuhausen. That got them so far, but post-war budget cuts, Cold War I should say, really got orders to be canceled. And by 1998, honestly, SIG, the parent company in Switzerland, is about done with guns. Now, as I said a little while ago, in the 50s they had 800, 900 people working there. By the 80s, this was down to 4 or 5, maybe 600 on a really busy day. Part of this is automation. Part of it is things are changing. By the late 90s, 200 or less folks work in the SIG firearms division. So the SIG parent company, the one that's been making wagons and packing materials and all this since 1853, they decide to sell off all the firearms. This includes the SIG-Sauer GMBH in Germany. This includes SIG Arms in the USA. All the firearm stuff gone. Well, there's an investment group, a speculative group, known as the Luke and Ortmeier Group. It's German. And in 2000, they buy it all. But it's not just the SIG interest. They also buy the J.P. Sauer Company, what's left over, because it's all tied together, but also companies like Blazer and Mauser and some others. Their stated goal is to kind of preserve these old makers that have been through all kinds of bankruptcies and turnovers and shifts. Anyway, they consolidate them together. It's a little hard to say what L&O do because they are a private company. They're not publicly traded. But they do end up owning everything. This is important. So, really nothing changes in Germany with the GmbH for a minute. In Switzerland, the former SIG weapons division, firearms division, is renamed in 2001 to SAN, Swiss Arms Neuhausen. This is important to note, Neuhausen. This is the same complex, the same buildings, even some of the same people that have been working there. Of course, there's always personnel turnover, and it is downsized. It'll get down to the point of only having 50 full-time employees within a couple of years because they've delivered all their STGW-90s. The military isn't really buying much. Budget cuts, as I've already mentioned. Over in the U.S., SIG Arms, while they're doing very well with their designs, now, again, this is a newer one, but they're doing different things, making more and more stuff here. But by 2004, they're not financially very viable. This is before the assault weapons ban comes off. This is before they really get into rifles of any note. They're just doing handguns, and it's a pretty crowded market. This is before the suppressor craze. This is before the conceal and carry craze. This is also where Ron Cohen comes in. By 2005, he's there. And by 2007, the name has changed from SIG Arms to SIG-Sauer Incorporated of Exeter, New Hampshire. On the positive side, they do vastly expand their product line. They tried the SIG SG or SIG 556. They try the SIG 551A1. They get into AR-15s like the 400. They eventually will do the MPX, although it takes them a long time to actually come out. They do the MCX, the Virtues, all that. They do ammunition. They get into suppressors. They get into optics. So they do expand. And I will say, Cohen, or whoever else you want to give credit to, does turn it around financially. And so L&O, the parent company of everything, is happy. But while they can step in, while they can intercede, they don't. Each company, the SIG USA, SIG Switzerland, SIG Germany, has their own leadership, their own CEOs. And they do their own thing. At least until L&O have to step in. Germany, Eckfurt's bread and butter is still the 220. They also do like the 2002, 2022. They do various things. They are expanding promo. Switzerland, they don't really do much in the way of handguns. They're really focused on the SG-55 series. And the U.S. is, like I said, diversifying. And for a while, it's going really well for them, publicly. In fact, in 2014, they're planning a move to a new, more modern, larger facility, still in New Hampshire, but in Newington. And this seems to have been completed by 2017. Cohen's still in charge there. But not without some controversy. Should we talk about it here? Sure, why not? Yeah, going back around 2011, 2012, he pulls some shenanigans. Germany, especially at this point, 21st century, has some export laws. Well, he has around 38,000 pistols made in Eckfurt and then sent to SIG-Sauer Incorporated, New Hampshire. And these are going to Colombia. The problem is the end user certificate doesn't reflect this because the German government would not approve of this for political reasons. And this goes undiscovered for a few years, but by 2014, 2015, they're starting to see the discrepancy in the records. This actually leads to Cohen getting arrested when he gets off the airplane in October of 2018. He's under arrest in custody for about a week and a half before posting bail, and goes to trial in February of 2019, pleads guilty, gets a suspended sentence of roughly a year and a half, pays a big fine, and basically is persona non grata in Germany at this point because of falsifying documents. Yeah, it's not a good thing, dude. Of course, over in the USA, this doesn't make near as much of a splash because, other things are going on in 2014, 2015, 2017 for SIG. Of course, this is when they win with their 320, the MHS, the M17, and eventually the M18 comes out too, and actually kind of becomes the unpopular one. A lot of things are going on. Eventually, there's the XM5/XM7 thing. You get what I'm saying. I'm bringing this up because right now we still have 3 SIGs, but not for long. In June of 2020, SIG GMBH, SIG-Sauer GMBH, in Germany announces they're closing, or rather L&O pretty much orders it because of all the controversy. They're in big hot water with the government. They've already been iced out of the Bundeswehr, the SSB program to develop a replacement for the G36, the one that Haino won, and then HK1 talked about that recently. So they closed Germany in the middle of 2020. This is actually how and why SAN in Neuhausen, Switzerland, is renamed to SIG-Sauer AG by 2021. It's more complicated than that, but you get the idea. So after being SAN for 20 years, they're under the name SIG-Sauer. And you still have SIG-Sauer Incorporated, New Hampshire. So for the last 4 years, we've only had 2 SIGs. And they are independent and doing their own thing. Cohen is CEO in the USA, and Pasquale Caputi is CEO in Neuhausen, Switzerland. In some of the same buildings, Heck, they have some of the old tooling from the 19th century down in the basement that were making guns back in the late 19th century. Names change, ownership overall changes. They're doing their own thing. And they've actually expanded the SG-55X product line quite a bit. For example, the last version that was really made by the old SIG was the 5.52. It had issues. One of the first things that the new one did was they made the 5.53 by 2007. So that's kind of their bread and butter. They are no more or less associated with the USA than you would be your brother. Same parent, same maybe genetics, but you can't control what your brother does and your brother can't control what you do. One is not over the other, in both are adults doing their own thing and really appealing to very, very different markets. So I wanted to be very clear about that and clear about the quality of the Swiss-made items. They're absolutely as good as ever because it's the same production lines except for updating that they've always had. As long as this video has been, that's still oversimplifying things because legal stuff, though in Germanic legal stuff, it gets even more so. The point is, yeah, they're still Switzerland. They're essentially the same company as always. I mean, everyone's changed. Remington, Colt, Smith & Wesson, Springfield, whatever. And, of course, SIG USA grew out of just an import company to an assembler, to a designer, to a full-fledged creator, and now a huge factory. I will say that the Neuhausen division has rebounded some. They have hired new people back. They're still not as big as they once were, maybe 100 people. But to be fair, with modern automation, you don't need as many people, and their orders are still much smaller because of the world we live in today. So, there. Now, I've said about all I could say about the P320 in the first video. I explained why I did it when I did it at the beginning of this one. You know, I promised you to kind of mess with this throughout the video, but I've been busy. You might have noticed. But, you know, I've never had issues with this gun. And, you know, when things happen, when you're already manipulating the trigger, when you're already putting pressure on it, you have to realize you've got pressure in your hands. My gun has been fine. And, well, I don't have near as much experience with this one. It seems fine, too. I certainly haven't noticed anything. If anything, it fits even tighter. Of course, it hasn't had as many rounds through it. You know, when your finger does. Now, I was talking about that thing that I noticed on Jay's. I'll do my best to explain. There's your striker right here. Spring back and forth. We know, we've all seen him think. But what I noticed on Jay's, this moving it around was rough as a cob. And it really seems like it's the machining inside the slide more than anything else. Again, mine's smooth. No issues. But I could understand if it were rough and catching on a burr temporarily and then getting jostled and kind of being on that cusp, and then once it gets jostled just a bit, you know, getting laid down or bent over, just a little enough of a twist or a pressure, since it's only being held on maybe by roughness, letting go. But I don't know. I'm a firearms historian. I'm not a firearms engineer. That's me. Other people, better people, can tell you that. But it is a little sad that I've only handled a few of these in my life. Certainly under 100. Probably under 50. And if I'm already at least handling one that's suspicious out of my relatively small sample, even though I've got two here, especially the older one, that I feel really good about, my original conclusion of QC seems to stand. And by that I mean some will be perfectly fine. Some won't be. Now I know there's a lot of blame for MIM parts. MIM, just like casting, can be done fine. There are plenty of guns, and not to mention like parts in airplanes that are MIM, believe it or not. If the standards are fine, if the QC is good, no problem. But if it's sloppy, problem. But that's the case of anything, any kind of part, polymer, even machined parts, even forged parts. If the QC is sloppy, Lord knows what will happen. I definitely do not think the fully cocked striker is the issue, because I've owned a Walther P99 since 1999. I've had PPQs since 2011. I've had PDPs for the last couple of years too. I was a little late getting those, but those and others are fully cocked or 99%, whatever you want to call it. That's not the issue. As far as the safety stuff, I get those arguments about this being a relatively small surface. Agreed. You know, keep in mind too that patents are a thing, and sometimes manufacturers have to do things for that. But also keep in mind that it definitely seems like SIG-Sauer's numero uno goal is money. And for as cheap as they sold these to the military, no wonder. So my original conclusion, QC is there. That's speculative. What isn't speculative is there is a PR failure. Whatever reason exactly, whatever words or not words used, SIG USA, New Hampshire and Newington, has dealt with the public incorrectly. Even if the gun is proven fine, I'm not saying it will be. It's kind of like if you have a friend who's an asshole about being right. Even if they're right, they were still an asshole. There's a right way and a wrong way to talk to people, and SIG has picked the wrong way. And I don't see them coming back from that, but maybe I'm wrong. There are still people that defend SIG out there. And to be fair, I still plan on shooting these two guns. I will be extra cautious with them, absolutely, but these are never carry guns from me anyway. I mostly keep Walthers loaded, or sometimes a revolver for fun. I always do that, but yeah. This works fine. We'll see. But I just wanted to disambiguate, because SIG-Sauer in Switzerland, totally different company, different CEO, different standards. Trust me, they're just as dramatically anal about stuff today, and slow to ship stuff too, and small and detail-oriented as always. And I think that might be the main thing that's lost. SIG, even at its height, was a relatively small company who had everyone well-trained, well-versed. New Hampshire has blown it out to thousands of employees, subcontractors. It's no wonder QC has slipped. It's lost its roots, and has done so a long time ago. But it's now catching up with them. And it's a shame, because I really do feel like this gun, the Mark 25 and the M11A1, which is its compact version, are not only good guns, but they are objectively better than the real German imports. And that's not to say I hate the 226 or the 228 originals. I mean, I own one. I'm just pointing out an objective fact that the newer ones seem more durable. But either way, it's a far cry from, you know, where their handgun production kind of got started here. So in conclusion, here's my SIG pistol lineup. From the 210 through the 220 series and all that entailed, to the 229, and of course there's a lot of steps in between, like the P250, which is actually quite important for the individual story of the P320, but that's not really where we're at here. I just wanted to disambiguate and kind of talk about it. It's an interesting thing involving three companies. I should also mention that JP Sauer is still officially in business in Germany. They just handle high-end sporting type guns and stuff. So they did not get taken down directly with SIG-Sauer GmbH. but they're not really involved in all this. And the 320 was never made in Europe as such. It'll be very interesting to see how this story ends, because the truth is, if everyone's being honest with each other, we just don't know 100% what's going on here. You might think you do, and you might be correct, but it's still a theory that hasn't been 100% proven yet. But in time, it will be. And in time, well, who knows what will happen with Cohen. You know, could be a repeat of Germany, could be something totally different. But I wanted to mention all the kind of South American exports, because it is kind of interesting how that got tied into Colombia and how that kind of bit him in the butt, even though it wasn't Neuhausen that did it. So yeah, Newington, New Hampshire, Neuhausen, Northern Switzerland, those are our 2 remaining SIGs today. But for a while, there were 3, and for a while, very successful. And at the same time, both the US and the German and the Swiss companies were teetering on the edge at the early 21st centuries, and were brought back to greater or lesser extents. For what it's worth too, the Sturmgewehr 90 is still standard issue within the Swiss armed forces today, not to mention variants of the 5.53 and 7.51 and so on and so forth. So they're definitely not out for the count. They're just focusing on small, intricate, and very specialized production lines, whereas, well, the U.S. is, well, doing what they're doing. Anyway, if you could, please like, share, and subscribe. Like to help support us, there's Patreon or Super Thanks. Check out some of the older videos, especially on Swiss history. And like I said, next time I'm going to get back to kind of my regularly scheduled programming. Losing daylight, so catch you very soon next time.